Good afternoon. Thank you for the festival committee for inviting me and making space for this conversation, and thank you all for coming. Today I want to make one broad argument that spatial sound need not be from an ideal loudspeaker layout or single privileged listening position, or the presumption of one objective sonic truth waiting to be properly reconstructed. Rather, spatial sound begins from the situated listeners. And to explore that premise, I developed a democratized node-based diffusion architecture where everything or nothing is a sweet spot and where spatial decision-making can operate at the same temporal grain as musical gesture. I'll move in two parts. First, I'll discuss three principles that ground what I mean by subject-oriented spatialization, and then I'll dive into the node-based diffusion system, which is one possible theoretical technical realization of this framework. This project begins with dissatisfaction that many of you will recognize and several have mentioned in their presentations over the last 2 days. Much spatial audio practice, even when technically sophisticated, often inherits at least two design flaws. First, they tend to ignore, discount, or otherwise subordinate the perceptual agencies of the listeners. Second, they tend to be grounded in an ontology that presumes a single objective sonic truth, one correct rendering, or one intended image. That magic window for listening to this truth, of course, tends to be quite narrow, and in a performance setting, you can often observe the composer, performer, audio technician, or that first eager listener in the door in that one spot. Even systems that enlarge the audience area through expanded renderings, delay-based localization, retain the same governing aspiration that as many listeners as possible hear the same scene, the same spatial picture, the same intended event. And for me, that goal is philosophically unstable from the onset, because to borrow from Thomas Nagel, nobody ever hears from nowhere. Every listener hears from somewhere, through their body, from within a lived history, in a room, in motion or stillness, in attention or distraction, in memory, in anticipation. This is not a dismissal of Dolby Atmos or ambisonics or wavefield synthesis, delay-based panning, etc. All these have powerful and meaningful use cases, but my claim is simply this: if the reality of listening is plural, it is situated, it is irreducibly perspective dependent. Subject-oriented spatialization is especially valuable here because it treats perceptual difference not as a distortion of the work, but as part of its realization. A useful example for me here is Disney's It's a Small World. Writers move by boat through the sequence of stylized scenes. Roughly 150 times synchronized audio tracks sound across a point source environment. They're always sounding, but they are not equally audible all at once. It's the rider's physical movement through the ride that comprises the mix that they hear. So two people will undoubtedly leave the ride with that tune lodged in their memories for a long time to come, but neither one of them heard the exact same thing. The attraction remains coherent, not because it produces identical hearings, but because it produces differently inflected hearings that are all equally valid. And that principle lies directly underneath everything I'm doing here. Coherence does not require sameness. Musical experience can remain one experience while yielding multiple equally valid hearings. Some background, I take Christopher Small here as foundational because music is something we do rather than something we simply possess. Then listening is already participation, not reception. Vogelin sharpens that claim by refusing any clean separation between sound and the act of hearing it. And Oliveros adds an ethical and semantic dimension, treating listening as a disciplined practice of attention to self, others, and our environment. Monson contributes to the crucial social account of listening as perceptual agency, that conscious, situated directing of attention through which different listeners may hear the exact same experience quite differently. Following Eidesheim and Grimshaw, Augard, and Garner, I do not treat sound as a fixed referent or a purely physical object. I treat it as vibrational and emergent, relational. Lastly, from Blesser and Salter, I take the understanding that space itself does not merely house sound, but it actively helps shape it. It's from these principles, from this foundation that I will articulate the three principles of subject-oriented spatialization. Principle 1, listening as an active world-making. Listening is not passive reception. It is not the neutral intake of already finished sonic information. It is an active, interpretive, embodied, and generative act. Sound does not already arrive complete, already meaningful, already settled. It emerges in encounter among signal, room, body, memory, training, affect, attention. That is why Monson's language of perceptual agency is so useful here, because and why Eidsheimer's critique of the fixed referent matters so much, because meaning does not sit intact inside a sound waiting to be extracted. Listening helps make the event what it is. And that means that the listener is never merely receiving the world of sound. The listener is participating in its construction. If I hear the same sound after grief or joy or after study or exhaustion, I do not hear it neutrally. I hear it from somewhere. And that somewhere is not an accidental overlay on an otherwise pure object. It is part of the condition of hearing at all. And this is why I also think the sweet spot problem is not just a coverage problem. It is an ontological problem. The sweet spot assumes that there is one correct realization to be preserved, and then we ask how the room can help preserve it. The subject-oriented approach asks a different question. What kind of musical world is created when many different listeners, each hearing from somewhere, are taken as foundational rather than incidental? Principle 2 is what I call empathetic omniscience as listening practice. And I don't mean some sense of God's ear perspective floating above the room or some total listening, total hearing package. No hearing is from nowhere. So what I mean is an aspirational listening practice in which one cultivates awareness that one's own hearing is only one among many possible hearings, an effort to listen beyond oneself without pretending one has escaped oneself. That is why empathy matters here, and not merely as a loose metaphor. Empathy actually names the practice by which I begin to imagine how sound may be unfolding differently for somebody else, in another seat, another body, another history, another mode of attention. Oliveiros is central here because deep listening insists that listening can be cultivated as an expanded attentiveness to self, others, and environment altogether. In that sense, listening is not only perceptual, it is actually ethical. So empathetic omniscience does not erase difference by collapsing many hearings into one master perspective. It heightens one's relation to difference. For spatial composition, that means I do not want to design only for the seat that flatters the system best. I want to compose with an awareness that another listener, 30 feet away, may be hearing something different and no less musically meaningful. Empathetic omniscience names that and expands compositional awareness, in which difference is not a defect, but listening is one of its conditions. All right, principle 3, musicking as relational co-creation. Here I stay closest to Small, but I push his insight towards the listener more explicitly. If music is something that we do, then musical meaning arises relationally among composer, performer, listener, space, technology, and event. The listener does not merely receive the piece, the listener helps constitute it. Eidsheimer sharpens that claim when she places the listener at the point of origin of meaning. That formulation has been essential for me because it allows me to move away from the model where one stable object is transmitted intact into passive auditors, and towards a model in which one offering may give rise to many intended experiences. So in practical terms, this means I'm interested in spatial music that does not require every listener to undergo the same temporal or spatial experience in order for the piece to succeed. The piece remains one piece, but it may be co-created across multiple hearings, multiple embodiments, positions in space. The challenge then is not how to force sameness, but how to compose for different yet equally valid realizations of the same work. So taken together, these principles help establish a philosophical ground of subject-oriented approach. So now I'll turn to one technical realization of it. The system I'm about to describe is not the only way to realize subject-oriented spatialization, As It's a Small World shows, distributed point source systems already provide a pathway. My aim here was to make an architecture more the aim was not to make it an architecture more elaborate for its own sake, but in some sense return back to basics, to find a simple spatial unit that would preserve perspectival plurality, remain compositionally legible, and still give me enough structure to work with. That led me to a pairwise scheme. I was drawn to it not only because it kept the conceptual node lattice clear, but because pairwise imaging has long been one of the most reliable ways to preserve phantom focus. So the question was not whether was pairwise logic too simple, but how could it be extended without losing either its clarity or utility? At that point, the design problem became combinatorial. Given a certain speaker count, a certain number of interpolations per pair, or in the language of this graphic, nodes per pair, how rich can a field system become before it either is impractical or perceptually too blurred to be useful? And so this matrix graphic is how I arrived at the answer. Once I committed to the pairwise logic, the rest of the architecture flowed quite cleanly. Adding speakers does not simply increase coverage, it increases the number of possible pairwise correlations, and therefore the number of local sweet spots that can be composed with. But at a certain point, that term sweet spot begins to invert, and everything becomes a sweet spot, so nothing does. I landed on 26 speakers and 5 equal power positions per pair. So with 26 loudspeakers, there are 325 unique pairs. For each pair, I use 5 positions, 2 endpoints, and 3 intermediate placements. Across that full mesh, that yields 1,001 nodes, each corresponding to a distinct 26-channel gain vector. That becomes the system's lattice of possible states. Here, though, an important conceptual distinction has to be made. These nodes are conceptual. They are not a literal phenomenological map of what any listener hears in full. It's a physical and conceptual realities align only along a given chord for a listener that's equidistant between those 2 speakers pairs that generate it. So if the diagram were redrawn from the perspective of any one single listener, the lattice would be distorted and unique just for that listener. No single listener could hear the perspective of the entire field exactly as shown. But that does not weaken the system, it actually clarifies it, because the lattice is not a map of the listener's total experience, it is a structured field of possible hearings distributed across the room. Any particular node on the slide is true for at least one vantage, and across many listener positions, the field becomes experientially real in aggregate. That lets us stop asking whether the whole map is present for everyone all at once, and instead, whether it offers a rich and equally valid spatial relationship across many hearings. Once node single location is privileged, the entire field becomes compositional territory. From there, the next question is how motion is heard. What interests me is not simply a sound object gliding through space in one stable image, but it is how routes emerge from discrete activations. The parabolic image on the left is useful here. The curve is not primary, it emerges through ordered design. So too, in this system, trajectories emerge from successive activations of relational states, paths out of points, curves out of lines. And this is one reason Varese and Xenakis matter so much to me, le route du son. The nodes in my system remain ontologically stationary, much like the speakers in the Phillips Pavilion, but perceived motion emerges as route, delay, contour, wave, and passage. And because listeners are situated differently, the roads of sound will not be identical. But again, identically does not mean incoherently. The current implementation lives in max MSP. The venue is first mapped in 3 dimensions, and the node locations are associated with 26 channel gain data that is calculated in advance. That data is stored in a call file and then imported into a jitter matrix. The venue space is then quantized in a 7-bit grid, which yields a little over 2 million spatial units or voxels. A k nearest neighbor pass associates each voxel with the nearest node and corresponding gain tuple. These results are written into 2 lookup tables, both stored as audio files. This lets Max access the data on priority threads and at the audio rate. Rather than solving KNN in real time, a process wants to route sound. I do the expensive spatial analysis in advance and query it at runtime. So any process can identify an arbitrary point in space and within a single sample of audio time, retrieve the nearest node and its gain vector. At the output and control layers, I'm working directly with discrete outputs using Dante and OSC. In practical terms, this means that dense polyphony, multiple simultaneous routes, and combinatorial structures, spatial decision-making, embedded directly inside that music-making process. And at this point, this is where the technical and philosophical sides finally lock back together. The important thing is not just that the system is fast, it's that its speed allows spatial decision-making to happen at the same temporal grain as musical gesture. What the system produces is not one ideal image to be preserved. It produces a structured relational field. Each listener hears according to their own position, orientation, movement, history, attention. Those hearings are not identical, but they are also not arbitrary. They are shaped by the same lattice, the same routes, and the same compositional decisions. So the piece remains one piece, but it is one piece whose reality is distributed across many hearings. When I describe this as subject-oriented spatialization, I mean that quite literally. The system is designed around the subject and as a site of musical becoming. That assumes that plurality is not a residue to be managed after the fact. It is part of the compositional material right from the onset. So, to close, I am not arguing here that all spatial music ought to use this architecture or reject object-based rendering, ambisonics, immersive cinema formats, point source diffusion. We all breathe a sigh of relief. Different aesthetic questions call for different tools. My argument is narrower, that spatial music ought, at the very least, to confront the subject, because the subject is already there, already hearing, already world-making, already perceiving from somewhere, and transforming vibration into experience. If many prevailing systems inherit an ontology of one correct rendering, then a subject-oriented approach begins with a different ontology altogether. Not sound as a fixed object, but sound as a relational event. Not the listener as the destination, but as a collaborator. And that changes everything. It changes how we think about musical meaning. It changes how we think about spatial design. It changes what counts as success, and it changes what kind of world a piece of music might be allowed to become. Salome Vogelin writes that listening is not a receptive mode, but a method of exploration. And that feels exactly right to me. The future of spatial music, then, may not be the perfected delivery of one sonic truth. It may be the composition of richer conditions for plurality, more ways for sound, space, the listener to discover one another, more worlds to hear, more worlds to build, and more worlds to share. Thank you.